Hi, Sandra. So I see we've got a good number of participants. That's great. I think we'll give everyone one more minute, and then we'll launch into it. Okay, Sandra, everything good from your side? Should we get going?
Yes, I think we can start.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah, we were a bit uncertain on number of participants, but very pleased to see about 60 of you. Looking through the list, there's actually a lot of names that I don't recognize, so that's great. A great opportunity for us to showcase some of our work, some of the new materials we want to put out there, and also showcase some of the work from our partner from Chemi. As you saw from the invite, so we'll from Unitar's point of view, we will introduce a little bit of the work we have done on the GHS in the last few years, where we've been going. Our colleague Lisa Extig from Chemi will introduce herself, no doubt, and then introduce a little bit of the work of Chemi, particularly in relation to GHS. My colleague Sandra Mollenkamp will also introduce some of the new materials we've developed on the GHS, so some introductory elements to increase the knowledge out there. We've spent some time doing sort of different topics of the GHS, deeper elements, but this was an opportunity also to go back and really set up the fundamentals and get that out there for people to start using and even disseminating themselves. We will walk through one of those presentations with our senior expert, Leonard Dock, to introduce the GHS as part of this webinar. My colleague Sophia Schlezak from Unitar will also present on a recent project we undertook on roadmaps in El Salvador and Ecuador. So some of the key steps, some of the key lessons we learned in doing that process. And then we thought it would be nice, given that these GHS webinars, sessions that we often have, we get a real range of questions. But we also thought we'd had a range of stakeholders online, and we might therefore be able to answer different questions that come up. So there'll be a session at the end where everyone's really free to ask questions on the GHS, different elements, and we will try to answer it as best we can among the group. So please, put your questions in the chat or ask them as we go along, and we hope this is a useful exercise for everyone. So from that, I will move into presenting on Unitar's work. I'll just share my screen. Okay, Sandra, can you just confirm that's the presentation's coming up?
Yeah, it is.
Yep, perfect. Okay, so I developed this presentation yesterday, so I put yesterday's date, but of course today, 18th of April. So here is a little introduction into Unitar's activities, the prominence of the GHS, and just setting a bit of the background before we go into different details. So as many of you know, the GHS is often regarded as a fundamental component of the sound management of chemicals, applicable to all sectors. We talk about health, labour, agriculture, environment, transport, trade, and more. We go back to 2002, the plan of implementation by the World Summit on Sustainable Development that encouraged countries to implement the GHS as soon as possible. Of course, we're now in 2024 and still very much working on this. The High Ambition Alliance in 2019 stated it is essential that the GHS be implemented by all countries. And the Global Chemicals Outlook 2 back in 2019 also called for full implementation of the GHS. Another prominent part of this is agriculture, and FAO in their 2022 update to the guidance on good labeling practice for pesticides notes that the GHS has become the international standard for classification and labeling of chemicals, including pesticides. And this guidance recommends use only of the GHS for pesticide labeling. Added to this, we have the FAO and WHO strongly recommend progressive adoption of the GHS for classification and labeling of pesticides. So there we have the direct relevance to the FAO-WHO Code of Conduct on Pesticides. It's noted in the WHO Chemicals Roadmap. ILO Convention 170 is very specific on classification and labeling. There are elements in the Rotterdam Convention, Stockholm Convention as well, and these are referenced in our legislation guide that will be noted later. Highly hazardous pesticides, and further elements of sustainable trade development and chemistry. Just quickly going a bit deeper on HHPs, this is a topic with increasing attention, increasing awareness, and I think it's worth noting that within the 8 criteria of highly hazardous pesticides, you have 3 which reference the GHS immediately. So implementing the GHS, understanding it, using it for identifying pesticides is really an integral part of any work done on HHPs and pesticides management. We mentioned that 2002 call and the other political backing, but despite this, the GHS is still not operational in more than 120 countries. These are mostly developing countries and countries with economies in transition. So UNITAR, alongside ILO and UNECE, map as best we can. There is no formal reporting mechanism to say you're implementing the GHS. So as best we can, we monitor implementation around the world. And this is the map that we have showcasing, particularly in red, where there's no legal implementation of the GHS. And to note that this is based on previous work by academics back in 2017 and built on with the Global Chemicals Outlook 2 and ILO since then. And so much of the work we're focusing on is really working with these countries to increase the levels of implementation, support them as they develop legislation, and training, capacity building, and awareness to make sure that that implementation is as effective as possible. One of the great supports for that, we certainly hope, is the new global framework on chemicals. So there was much effort in the lead up to the conference in September last year in establishing a target on the GHS. We and many other stakeholders were very pleased that there was finally an agreed target, target B6, that by 2030, all governments have implemented the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals in all relevant sectors as appropriate for their national circumstances. The GHS was also part of an initial list of indicators to support measurement of the GHC. So there is clear support, clear prioritization of the GHS by putting it within those targets and within the initial list of indicators. And so we certainly hope that this new framework will support the global push for GHS. Just quickly running through UNITAR's activities. So we co-lead the global partnership to implement the GHS. We do this with ILO and OECD and a range of coalition partners. So governments, regional organizations, private sector, trade unions, academics, and NGOs. And we undertake broad activities for training and awareness raising, developing implementation strategies, and supporting the drafting and review of legislation. UNITAR specifically, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've supported multiple countries in developing their implementation strategies. In the old days, these were funded by the Quick Start program, and we continue to try to work with countries to access funding to develop these strategies and indeed take them further. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been able to directly support the drafting of legislation as well. In previous years, we've also worked at the regional level. So ASEAN was one in the past, and recently we worked with UNEP and the Gulf Cooperation Council to update their 2002 guidelines up to the 2022 version. And a prominent part of this was GHS and also links there to chemical accidents. Just a quick note for those who are familiar with the IOMC and the IOMC toolbox, we do have resources available on the GHS through that with the GHS scheme. One of the big guidance documents we have is developing a national GHS implementation strategy, and this was updated and republished in 2022. We've also successfully run an online GHS course over the past 10 years, and this provides quite in-depth technical understanding of the GHS. It takes about 11 weeks, part-time study. Often it's people who are working, so it fits around their work schedule. We do that in English and Spanish and run it twice a year. We are hoping also to have the French version available in 2024. So there are a great deal of non-financial resources we have available. We've put together lessons learned, implementation experience and know-how. There's guidance and advice that we can help coordinate and support access to data and information by showcasing where it can be found, what's available already around the world. So to increase that understanding and awareness that not all this new data information has to be developed every time in a country that may start to implement the GHS. And this is all to support the concept that making use of information that already exists can be very helpful in designing development activities at the national level. So that's just a quick run through of our activities. We very much hope, as I said, that the GFC really restarts that momentum, that commitment to the GHS around the world, and we look forward to working with those on implementing the GHS further. So I won't open it up to questions. I think those can come later, but you have my contact details and we will share the presentations and more information on the webinar on our webpage afterwards. So thank you everyone for your attention. With that, I will pass over to our colleague Lisa from Chemi. Please introduce yourself, Lisa, and then please go ahead. I understand you'll share your screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, I will try to do that at once. Do you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Oliver. I'm Lisa Ekstig. I'm from the Swedish Chemicals Agency. We have been cooperating with UNITAR in this project of this training material for GHS. And a little bit about myself. I have been an inspector at the Swedish Chemicals Agency and been working with enforcement for 11-12 years. And now I have recently started to work at the international unit, giving support to other countries with GHS, among other things. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Swedish Chemicals Agency's support in the development and implementation of the GHS. First of all, I just want to quickly go through the purpose and benefits of the GHS system. First and foremost, it enhances the protection of human health and the environment, providing an internationally comprehensible system for classification and labeling of chemicals and thus hazard communication as well. It provides a legal framework for countries without an existing system, and it's quite it's a framework that you can almost apply in your legislation as it is. So it's really a complete framework for classification and labeling of chemicals. It also reduces the need of testing and evaluation of chemicals, because if you have classified substances and mixtures according to GHS, you have done a lot of this work, and if you're sharing that data, it reduces the need for testing. It also facilitates international trade in chemicals whose hazards have been properly assessed and identified on an international basis. So that's another benefit of this system. When supporting countries and institutions in implementing the GHS, these have been the focus areas for KEMI the last years. First, the inclusion of GHS in legislation is the most important step because it gives the incentive for the industry to implement GHS fully. We have also worked a lot with institutional capacity building to support in that, and both when it comes to knowledge about the GHS and criteria, and when it comes to financing, how you can arrange that. And of course, enforcement, we think that's really important, because it's the only way to know if legislation works and make it work. The financing part is also important, of course. For example, how to finance chemical registers and the enforcement and help desks. That we also think is an important part to help industry to have a help desk where they can ask questions about the legislation. We've also been working with guiding of industry, further guidance, and public awareness. These are some of the countries and organizations we have worked with during the years with GHS, the implementation of GHS. For example, we have worked for a long time with South Africa, Zambia, and Taiwan and Uganda, and a lot of other countries. These are just some of them. And we have been working with everything from the implementation of GHS criteria in the country's legislation to give advice on what you should think about when implementing the GHS in legislation, to training mostly for inspectors, but also other stakeholders, both general training and really advanced training on the criteria, how to use them to classify substances and mixtures. And we have worked with organizations such as Africa Institute, SADC, and UCT. Just participating in the discussion groups and as experts in these groups for many years. We have also plans for GHS workshops in Moldova and Armenia and Ukraine, countries that are candidates for joining the EU. So we have a lot of different activities going on. We have also other activities where we have supported concerning GHS. For instance, we have an international training program that we have for many years, and that contains a special part just for GHS that we train in, and now we have plans for an advanced training for those who joined this special part of our training program this autumn in South Africa. We have also supported work together with FIO in their making of a pesticide toolkit, a web-based tool that has a special GHS module in it. So we have we have given some support in making that. We are participating in the UNEC subcommittee for experts on GHS, dealing with a lot of technical issues concerning GHS and the framework. We have for a long time been promoting inclusion of GHS in the global framework of chemicals that Oliver mentioned. We've been working on that for a long time, and then it was included, so that was a success. We have had several global partnerships to implement the GHS as today with UNITAR and also with OECD and ILO. And we have participated in the UCT, University of Cape Town's discussion forum for many years as well. And I also want to mention we have at Chemi we have an international help desk that you can contact if you want any support or guidance in introducing chemicals control and working with that. If you have the right to developmental aid, if you're one of those countries, you can contact our help desk. I want to just tell you briefly about our experiences from cooperation for GHS implementation outside the EU in these different countries that I mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, it's essential that legislation comes first that when you want to implement GHS in your country, because it gives an incentive, as I told you before, for the companies to implement it. And that the implementation in legislation has to be followed by enforcement to make the GHS work. And the fact that different departments or ministries are responsible can lead to challenges in implementation, because you have to coordinate the implementation between these different institutions. So that demands cooperation to set up that as well. Some experiences from when GHS was implemented in the EU, I wanted to mention briefly as well. We have noticed in the beginning the benefits of regional cooperation in the EU. That if we cooperate in drafting legislation and harmonizing enforcement, we have ongoing projects within the EU between the member states to harmonize enforcement of the GHS or CLP as it is in the EU. And we also cooperate a lot when it comes to help desk questions that are tricky. We interpret them together. So there are a lot of benefits with regional cooperation, we think. We also think it was wise to have long transitional periods in the legislation when implementing the GHS in our legislation, so that the companies have the time to adjust to this really extensive legislation. And when introducing GHS in your legislation, you have to deal with the new updated versions of the GHS Purple Book. I think we have the 10th revision right now, and in EU we have dealt with it by we make changes in the CLP regulation through EU delegated regulations. So there are updates regularly. In the CLP regulation in EU, we also have a mandatory help desk in all EU countries. So that's a good thing to have in the legislation, that you have to have a help desk in every country. And there are a lot of industry benefits through union legislation that the same rules apply in a big area. yes, that was all from me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yes. Do you want to add anything there, or no?
No.
No. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Yes, and that your last reference there, very very interesting in terms of updates. It's often something we hear of how that's dealt with. So I think certainly something as we continue to work with partners on dealing with that, examples from around the world, and the EU one, of course, very prominent. So thanks very much for that. So Sandra, I'll pass over to you, and you can just explain a little bit more about the recent project on training materials we've undertaken, and explain what's been developed. Thanks, Sandra.
Yes, thank you. I will share my screen. So please let me know if you can see it.
Yep, not in presentation mode, but we can see
No.
the PowerPoint.
I will do it now. I have all these other things on my screen as well because I'm also the host of this meeting, so I have to search a little bit. So good day, everybody. I would like to briefly show you some of the materials that we have recently been developing with the Swedish Chemicals Agency, as Lisa also mentioned, as well as some other relevant materials that some of the persons who will present after me will certainly also refer to. So the idea is that you will know what materials there are and where you can find them, so you will be able to go through them in your own time and look at the materials that are most relevant for you. So with Chemi, we have developed 3 different kinds of materials. First of all, we developed 4 presentations, a presentation about what is the GHS, a second presentation about hazard classification, a presentation about hazard communication, and the last presentation about implementing the GHS and available data on substance classification. The presentations you can find on our website, which I will show you a little bit later. So Unitar will use these presentations ourselves when we are at workshops and during webinars, but you can go through them and use them yourselves. And we think that most of the slides in these presentations are self-explanatory. So however, some may need some more explanations, and since we didn't want to put too much text on the slides, we have included explanations in some slides in the notes, so below the slides. So when you look at the presentations, please don't forget to look at the notes as well. And then secondly, we have developed some leaflets, and they have the same topics as the presentations. And I think they provide a good summary of what the GHS is all about. So we have a presentation about introduction to the GHS, talks about purpose and aim and benefits and elements of the GHS, presentation about hazard classification, hazard communication, and the last leaflet about implementation, and also available data on substance classification. And then finally, the third kind of material we developed are 2 videos. These are 10 minutes videos. They are very short. Each video is divided into 2 parts. So they provide a visual introduction to the GHS. Video 1 is about what is the GHS. It explains the aims, the objectives, the development and implementation of the GHS. And the second video discusses the content of the GHS and talks about hazard classification and communication. So the question is, where can you find these materials? Now I will try to go to the web page. So is it possible to confirm that you are now looking at the web page?
Yep, we can see that.
Okay, so this is the GHS part of the Unitar website. If you would like to go to our materials, you scroll down. But first of course, you can read the GHS part, but you scroll completely down. And then you will find the leaflets. So here are the 4 leaflets. Just below, we have a PowerPoint presentations. It's connected in, or it's in one file. And then we have the 2 films divided into 4 parts. I will share the link in the chat function later on. So you can, because it's quite a long link, so you can't easily find it. So I will share it in the chat function later on, so you will be able to find it back. And then there are some materials, other materials as well, which may be of interest for you. First of all, document developing a national GHS implementation strategy, and the other one, options for legislation and standard setting to implement the GHS. There are a few other interesting materials as well, which you can find on the Global Partnership to Implement the GHS website, which is this one. Again, you can first read everything about the partnership. Here you find the outputs related to partnership work streams. So we have the strategy, developing a national GHS implementation strategy, the legislation guidance, and also interesting, I think, is the key elements of a national GHS roadmap, about which Sophia will tell a little bit more later on. And here the study on lessons learned. So there are 2 websites where you can find all the informations. I invite you to look at them later on. I will share the links in the chat function, so you can copy them and you can find everything back. And in case you have questions, you can always contact us. We have a general email address, ghs@unitar.org, or you can directly write to me or to my colleague Oliver Wooten as well. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Yes, we've thought it was very important just to be very clear, showcase that these have now been developed and published, these new materials, and where they are, and of course some of the other materials, some of the other documents and information that we've produced over the last few years. Just as a refresher to those who have seen it before and to any new colleagues and participants today. But to go through one of those materials, we have invited our senior expert, Lennart Dog, who worked on these, and we will pass over to you, Lennart. So please introduce yourself, and then I'll let you take up the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will do that shortly. Just to introduce myself, Lennart Dog. I worked for 20 years at the Swedish Chemicals Agency, KEBI, a colleague of Lisa. And also part of my work was to act as a program manager for the ITP that Lisa mentioned, and where Sophia, that you will hear from later on, was one of the participants. And I also was head of the Swedish delegation at the UN Subcommittee of Experts on the GHS, so very much involved in the development of the GHS, although not from the very beginning, but throughout the various revisions of the GHS that had taken place. And now I've actually retired from KEMI, but I am a consultant to the UNITAR, and I've been working with this material that you heard about from Sandra. And I'm very much looking forward to give you a snapshot of some of the content of this material. And I will share my screen, so you will see that. Hang on a bit. I hope you have it in the presentation mode now. You see it?
Yep.
Let's confirm.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Very good. So this is basically a short introduction to the GHS, the content of the GHS, and the slides were taken from the 4 sets of slides that Sandra mentioned. So it's basically, I've taken out a few slides from these 4 presentations. And so I will just, for those of you who are not very familiar with the GHS, this could be an introduction to the introduction, so to say. So the purpose of the GHS, and Lisa mentioned this, was of course then initially to provide a tool for protecting human health and the environment by a system for hazard assessment and communication. And it's important then to remember that GHS is hazard-based. And the idea is, of course, that is, as it is on intrinsic properties of chemicals, those properties are the same wherever you are in the world. So it makes good sense to have one uniform system that can be adopted and implemented across the globe. And some countries had legal systems for classification and labeling of chemicals when the GHS was developed. One of these was in the European Union, another one was in Canada, and we also had one in the US. And we had an international system for the classification of dangerous goods. And all of these were fed into the work to develop the globally harmonized system. So if countries do not have a system for classification and labeling, this GHS provides a very good legal framework to develop such legislation in various jurisdictions. And if we can agree on classification on specific substances on a global basis, we do not need to test them for properties, hazardous properties in individual countries, because we could say that it has been tested, it has been recognized that it has some hazardous properties, and we can agree on that and use that when we communicate the hazard and handle the chemicals. And if we also have a uniform system across the world, then we would not need to, well, that will facilitate trade, of course, because once the chemicals have been assessed and the hazard recognized, it will facilitate trade in an international basis. And as mentioned earlier by Oliver, the hazard classification is very fundamental to chemicals management, because we need to know when we deal with chemicals and we handle chemicals, substances and mixtures, first what it is, the identity of the chemical, and then another question is, of course, is it hazardous? How can we handle this chemical safely? And we need to communicate that throughout the supply chain. So people that are dealing with these chemicals, handling them, storing them, disposing them, need how to handle them safely. So that is what this pyramid represents. We have the basis, the hazard classification is the foundation to any system, any legislation dealing with chemicals. Without knowledge on the properties of the chemicals, of course, how can we advise people how to handle them? How can we ensure safe handling? How can we do a risk assessment comparing exposure and properties and get at understand the risk of using these chemicals? So this is what I would like to stress, that a system for hazard classification and communication is the foundation for any system on chemical management, whether it's pesticides, whether it's workplace chemicals or food additives or what have you. So that's a very important take-home message. And then if we look into the GHS, what does it really contain? It's two parts, and this also goes back to my previous slide. The one part is on hazard assessment, and these contain criteria for classification, answering the question if a chemical is hazardous and how hazardous it is. And then the other part of the GHS is on hazard communication. How do we make people aware of the hazard? And there are two ways of doing that. You can either put labels directly on the pesticide or chemical container, and you can also put it on or provide users with safety data sheets, which are, of course, more comprehensive, where you can find more information. And this is particularly for professional users. But ordinary people going to the general store buying cleaners or detergents or other kind of chemicals, they are usually only get the information through the labels. And the GHS specify how a label should look like, what information it should contain, and it should be very easily understood, and it should be clear, and it should also, of course, be written in the national language or the official language of the country where these chemicals are placed on the market, so people can understand it. And that can be a challenge in these days when it's very easy to import chemicals from abroad, and then if you get the chemicals from somewhere around from another country in a distant part of the world, maybe they have a label, but the label is completely impossible to understand because it is written in another language. So that's one of the worries with authorities like the Swedish Chemicals Agency with these online training and personal import of chemicals. So and then the hazards in the GHS, they are divided in 3 different parts, and they are covered in 3 different chapters of the GHS. So 3 different parts, I would say, of the GHS. The chapters and sub-chapters 2 and 3 and 4. So we have physical hazards, we have health hazards, and environmental hazards. And there are 17 physical hazard classes. I will show them in a little bit. 10 health hazard classes and 2 environmental hazard classes. And the hazard classes, they describe the type of hazard, what kind of hazard that is. And if we look at the physical hazard classes, here we have a direct link to the UN manual of testing criteria on the transport of dangerous goods. And this was one of the parts that were used to develop the GHS. So if you have colleagues that are working with the transport of dangerous goods, they will recognize all these physical hazard classes because they're exactly the same criteria as we have in the transport of dangerous goods. That's of course because that was already existing when the GHS was developed. So the part of the GHS that deals with physical hazards are exactly the same as the transport of dangerous goods. So it basically are properties like flammability, explosivity, oxidizing potential, metal corrosion, and also pressurized gases. And the reason why we have so many 17 hazard classes is, as you can see, it also differentiated according to aggregation state. If you look at, for example, you have flammable gases, flammable liquids, and flammable solids in 3 different hazard classes. You have pyrophoric liquids and pyrophoric solids in 2 different hazard classes, but the property is similar, of course. It just that you test liquids and solids differently. And here also you have details on how to test chemicals for these different hazardous properties, and the criteria are found in the UN manual of tests and criteria also, but they are reproduced in the GHS. I mention also that the hazard criteria are applicable both to substances and mixtures. There is a difference between classifying mixtures for health and environmental hazards, because there you need to know the ingredient substances of a mixture and the concentration in order to classify the mixture. You do not test the mixture itself. But for physical hazard, you need to test the mixture, because you can have a flammable chemical and an oxidizing chemical, and if you mix them, you will create an explosive mixture. So you have to, you cannot count, deduce the property of the mixture solely from the ingredient chemicals. But for health hazards and environmental hazards, you do not test the mixture normally, but you use the ingredient substances and their classification to classify the mixture. I hope I was able to explain that to you. Now, for health hazard classes, there are 10, and they are acute toxicity, irritation and corrosion to skin and eye. And then we have sensitization, respiratory or skin sensitization, allergic reactions. Then we have what's called the CMRs, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, and reproductive toxicity. And these are very serious health effects, of course. Then we have 2 hazard classes that cause specific target organ toxicity. So some chemicals may cause damage to specific organs in non-lethal concentrations, either after single exposure or repeated exposure. And I usually take methanol as an example. So if you are exposed to methanol, if you drink methanol containing liquid, you may survive, but you may go blind. So it's specific toxicity to the eye in that case. And then the 10th hazard class is aspiration hazard. It's also very serious health hazards where no test systems are available, but these are generally liquids, hydrocarbon liquids that can, if you happen to swallow it and you cough it up and it enters the airway, it can have lethal effects. One example is gasoline. You can survive swallowing a small amount of gasoline, but if that gasoline somehow enters your lung, it may be lethal. So that, of course, is a very serious health hazard. Now, one thing is that, well, I will come back to this because I will refer back to what Lisa mentioned, the EU CLP regulation, when I come mention a bit about implementation later on. Environmental hazard classes, presently there are 2, hazardous to the aquatic environment and hazardous to the ozone layer. Now, hazardous to the aquatic environment, why is it not hazardous to the environment? It says hazardous to the aquatic environment because you use aquatic organisms for testing, but you should really consider chemicals that are hazardous to the aquatic environment, that they may also cause toxicity to other organisms in the environment, not only aquatic organisms, because if it is toxic to fish, then other mammalian species living on land may also consume that fish and be intoxicated. So there were at one time discussions to have a hazard class hazardous to the terrestrial environment, but that got stalled in the process. So it still is hazardous to the aquatic environment. But the symbol, the pictogram for showing the hazard is a dead tree and a fish. So you can see it's not only a dead aquatic organism, it's also a terrestrial organism, a tree. Hazardous to the ozone layer is basically chemicals covered by the Montreal Protocol. But now the Montreal Protocol has been extended, so it also covers other chemicals that do not work through damaging the ozone layer. So there are discussions ongoing in the subcommittee now to revise this chapter on environmental hazard classes, to have hazardous chemicals hazardous to the atmosphere, which is an interesting discussion, of course, because then it can bring in the greenhouse gases also here. But that's ongoing. So presently, the 10th revision of the GHS, as Lisa mentioned, is the most recent one. It was adopted in 2022 and published last year. And they contain these 2 hazard classes. And I don't expect there will be any difference in the 11th revised edition that is up for discussion now in December. But we'll see. As I mentioned, it is a challenge with the GHS to follow up on these revisions and to have legislations that can take care of revisions as they are published. So your GHS legislation eventually is not up to date, and other jurisdictions may have another version of the GHS, so that may be a bit confusing. But anyway, let's move on now. And these were the hazard classes, 3 types of hazard classes, 3 types of hazards. We differentiate, as I said, between physical, health, and environment. Now, within each hazard class, there's also differentiation based on either the severity of the effect, the severity, or the weight of the evidence. If you, for health hazard, compare animal data, in vitro data in cell cultures, or human experience. The general differentiation is the higher, from high to low. Example is you use figures like 1 for the most hazardous effect, and go down to 2, 3, 4, 5. This is different in different hazard classes, but the general idea is number 1, if it's category 1, this is the most serious effect. So acute toxicity category 1, that has a lower, you are effective at a lower dose level than if it is a category 5. In fact, some jurisdictions even have not adopted category 5 for acute toxicity, but have 1, 2, 3, 4. Others have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's also something to look into when you classify or get chemicals from other jurisdictions. So if one jurisdiction does not use the category 5 while your own does, then you may import something that looks unclassified, but it should be classified in category 5 in your jurisdiction. So if you're working on it. So that's also something to bear in mind when you look into how chemicals are classified in different jurisdictions. And I mentioned also the weight of evidence. For instance, if you look at chemicals that are classified as carcinogenic, if we have human data, then they are immediately classified as category 1. Whereas if you have just animal data and not perhaps only in one species and very old data, and this of doubtful significance maybe, then they can be a category 2. But the thing is that even though we're talking about human evidence, it's not allowed to test on humans. You cannot say that, okay, I will test this to see how hazardous it is in humans. So testing chemicals for classification purposes is not allowed. It's very clearly stated in the GHS. So what we're meaning here is that what we mean is that we can have, for instance, case reports, we can have occupational health findings that some chemicals, like some of the carcinogenic metals, we have occupational data that they are carcinogenic to humans. They may not be carcinogenic in animals. We have not been able to reproduce that, but that doesn't matter because we know that they're carcinogenic to humans. So of course, we classify them. And also on the other end, if we have positive data in animal studies, well-conducted animal studies and showing effects, but we do not have human data, then we of course classify based on the animal data, because we do not want to sit around and wait to see that people get serious health harm because we do have this animal data. So positive animal data do not negate lack of evidence in humans. So that's also very important to bear in mind. You cannot say that, well, these people are working with this chemical and they feel fine. If you have animal data showing that, well, this chemical actually can cause cancer, then you classify it. You cannot say that just because we haven't seen effects in humans, we consider the chemical non-hazardous. That's also very important to bear in mind. So for communication, then I mentioned that we have labeling, and the labels are made up of various elements. We have pictograms, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner here. There are 9 different pictograms, and they should represent the type of hazard associated with with this chemical, both the type and severity, because you can change the pictogram within a hazard class when you go down in the seriousness. If you go from category 1 to category 5, you may change the pictogram. Signal words, there are 2: danger, which is for more severe hazards, and warning for not so serious hazards. We have hazard statements, and they describe the hazard in some detail. And then you have precautionary statements, and they are guiding you on how to handle the chemical and how to avoid accidents, and how you dispose of the chemical and how you store the chemical. And I have an example here. This is a Swedish bottle, so if you're able to read the text, you would probably not understand it because it is in Swedish. Then you can have additional information on the label, like who is selling the chemical, who's supplying it, and what it contains, and some supplemental information. Maybe if it is hazardous, you can have call the Poison Information Center and the number and the contact details to the supplier. The challenge here is to create pictograms or symbols that are easily understood. And there have been testing on this, the comprehensibility testing is actually a part of the GHS, and that chapter, I know Andrea Rother has joined us for this webinar, and she was involved in comprehensibility testing. And the symbol that usually creates the most problem is the one to the far right, which looks like an explosion within a human figure. And that's something to be very aware of, because that symbolizes a serious health hazard. So if you have a chemical that is labeled with that pictogram, you really have to read the label carefully, because then it's a serious health hazard that chemical can cause. Some of the other ones are quite easy to understand, like the skull and crossbones for acute toxicity, and the flame, of course, for flammable chemicals. And on the top right, you see the corrosivity pictogram, which is actually both used for physical hazards, corrosivity to metals, and for serious eye damage and skin corrosion. So that's one pictogram that is used both for physical hazard and health hazards. And the lowest pictogram, the exclamation mark, is of course just to draw your attention to the label, because it doesn't say anything else than pay attention, read the label. The safety data sheet, I won't go into in detail, but you can see they contain 16 sections, including like the hazard identification, what's in this container with chemicals, and toxicological information, and that's the part section 11, where you can get information of how it affects human health, and the section 12, how it will affect the organisms in the environment. And you can see there are, and also 4 and 5, section 4 and 5 is what to do in case of accidents, either human exposure for first aid measures, and how to extinguish a fire, because it's you have to be aware that for not all chemical, it's good to pour water on it. So it could be giving you advice how to handle accidents and fire, and also accidental release, and how to store it, and so on. So it's quite extensive information that should be provided to the professional users of these chemicals. Also, what's in the material that has been provided by UNITAR is, well, if you have this globally harmonized system, you should have a globally harmonized inventory of hazardous substances, wouldn't you? I mean, it's a nice idea, but there is no global classification list. However, if you go to the OECD eChem portal, and there's more about this in the material that's UNITAR provided, there is a link to classification and labeling, and there you can go to GHS classification, And here you can get into some databases that provide GHS information on classification according to the GHS. And I would specifically point to the ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency's classification and labeling inventory, because that's the most extensive database on classifications. And Lisa mentioned also the harmonized classification, the EU wide legally binding classification of a number of, it's almost, well, it's over 4,500 chemicals that has a legally binding classification within the EU, and also in the UK. The UK has left the European Union, but they have also their own mandatory classification list, which is actually the same as the EU still has. So eChem portal is one way of getting into this information. And you have the link at the bottom here, and there's more about this, of course, in the material that Unitar provides on its website. And that was all I wanted to say. I think this was just, as I said, an introduction to the introduction, and that's more information when you go to the original PowerPoint presentations available on the Unitar website. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lennart. Yes, very useful. Indeed, we didn't want to spend people's time methodically going through all the materials, but that's a great introduction to what we have. And so participants know now that it's there on our website. It's for us to use. It is also available for others to use, hopefully supporting that kind of train the trainers approach. These are actually materials that those potential trainers will be able to use should they so wish. We have had a couple of questions come through. I think we'll still come to those later, but they're being noted. We'll try and bring them up, and we'll try and get the best answer as possible. But for now, we will move on to Sophia, who will talk through our recent experience with roadmaps and go through some of the main steps. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Can you hear me well?
Yep, and we can see your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for staying in this webinar. It's very exciting to be presenting great presentations before. It's really nice also to be just next from Lennart, a colleague that we share some experiences before. I am Sofia Schlesak. I'm working as a training assistant, also at the Chemicals and Waste Management Program. And in my presentation today, I will show you some lessons learned from a recent experience we have with two countries in Central and South America, Ecuador and El Salvador. So this is very, I would say, practical. So we will get all that theory, those concepts that were explained before, and we will see how we can use that and to draft legislation and to make that a reality in countries. So, of course, one of the main target audiences for my presentation today would be government representatives. However, it is very important, and I will emphasize that through my presentation, to include and to create spaces for other stakeholders' input, such as industry representatives, associations, the civil society, including NGOs and the academia. Okay, so I'll start with a description of these projects. We started in November 2022, and this project finished by March 2023. So these two were very short projects, but very successful because we ended up with deliverables, commitments from countries, including workshops and webinars. So I must say that this was a very successful experience. As I said before, the beneficiary countries were Ecuador and El Salvador, and in particular, the focal points, let's say, were the ministries of environment. So, and that is connected to a point I want to make later on, the importance of having a leading a ministry or a leading authority that is committed to follow up with the activities, to communicate, to provide the necessary information, and to connect with the different authorities on the ground. And of course, it was really important to work together collaboratively with the UNEP office in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also work with the regional center of Basel and Stockholm Convention in Latin America, based in Uruguay. And so all together, we work on developing the roadmaps and also organizing workshops and webinars, and getting the first commitments from the countries, working on the agreements and all of that is part of the general project management activities. From our side, we had the pleasure to count on Mr. Fabian Benson's support. He's a GHS senior expert. He works mainly in the region. And then Oliver and myself, we work more for the coordination and supporting also with technical expertise. And so this is for you to have an idea of the context and the background of these two projects. And so one of my main messages in this presentation is this, right? Is so how to take a concept into action. And that is not easy, as it seems in this slide. But let's think a little bit about the concept. What is the concept? The concept is that we all agree, and this is also supported by the GHS, the Global Framework on Chemicals, to have accessible information, available information, harmonized about the chemicals, right? So this is just a concept that is globally accepted, globally agreed, but how to make that concept a reality. That's the hard part of the process. So action would be, what would we'd like to see is chemicals are classified and labeled. And it's not only about that, as Leonard previously explained, and I took very quickly this image from his presentation. It is important to have a chemical classified and labeled, but also make sure that the audience can understand that information, because that's the key message and the purpose of all of this international movement, right? So at the very end, that's what we want. And so how can we go from this concept to reality from our perspective? And the global perspective is also putting a lot of emphasis on generating legislation, generating an institutional coordination, and consolidating the structure at the institutional level. So this figure here, you will find them in the documents that Sandra previously mentioned. I also included this list of documents in this slide, but let's start with the figure here. So first step would be to consolidate a national coordination and communication body, right? It could be a committee. Some countries have working groups. Some others have subcommittees. The main idea here is that we need a lead authority, or authorities in plural it could be, but it is important that one commits to ensure the continuity of activities and the deliverables and the objectives are achieved. And also ensuring that communication is frequent and they really get the necessary information and endorsement, of course, for the next steps. So once we have a platform or this space of in the cooperation, then we will need to start analyzing the situation at the local level. So we call this situation and gap analysis. That includes, of course, a legal analysis and the general context, identifying different institutions, and all of that I will explain with further details later on. At the same time, in parallel, we will need stakeholders to get involved, not only from the government, but also from industry, the civil society. Why? Because we need that these groups are aware of what is going on, what is going to be achieved in the future. It is important for them to be able to provide with comments, and of course to make decisions based on information, right? To be able to make informed decision. And for that, it's important to have continuous workshops, webinars, developing information, sharing information, and including them in different platforms as well. It could be intersectorial working group, for example. Then we have the development of the strategy. So once we have everyone engaged and we analyze the situation at the local level, then we start analyzing what would be better, best in terms of the local context. So for that, we can develop a sectorial implementation plan, and of course, finally, a legal framework. And then the final part, this is the endorsement of the strategy and a workshop to communicate this strategy with all the stakeholders. The reason this is in red color is because this was out of the scope of the projects that I'm presenting today, but these 4 big steps would be the key, the key stages for the process. Key messages here. As any effort for implementing a chemicals legal framework, GHS implementation is a multi-year and ongoing journey. So it is important that from the beginning, there is a long-term commitment. That's why we give a lot of importance to this national coordination and communication body. Then, of course, as you will see, this is very country specific, because every country will start from a different starting point, and that's why the strategy is different from, depends on the countries. So the implementation steps will be adapted to that. Here are the 4 documents that Sandra already mentioned, and you can consult. And so from these documents, you will get all the necessary information to replicate this approach. And this is more, I would say, like concrete. It seems to be a little bit of micromanagement here, but this is for you to have a clear idea of how we work in such a very short amount of time, and how important it is to have a very concrete work plan with a specific and small deadlines. And I want to mention that summer holidays were in between, and we did it anyway. So there is no excuse to really work hard on this topic. So in October 2022, the countries confirmed their interest in the project, and we started with all the arrangements for the project. Then we had the first meeting where we, as UNITAR, met with the country, and we agreed on a work plan, right, for the next months. And this was the first in the first instance for consulting, for asking for information. So the gap analysis started there. We share an Excel spreadsheet. I will show you how it looks like. And then the countries during November and January, they collected information from different ministries, different departments and stakeholders as well. That's why this little symbol there, it means like local coordination at the local level. We had another meeting in December when we analyzed the collected information. We discovered other gaps. We had clarification questions, and same in the third meeting. And once we had all the necessary information to really understand the situation in the countries, then we start drafting the roadmap. UNITAR provided the first draft, and then the countries, they came to the different ministries and they provided additional comments. And so we reached a final version in March 2023. And once we have this roadmap that it looks like it's a written commitment. Of course, it's now it's in a soft way because it's not in a legal framework. It hasn't been published as a decree, law, or regulation, but it is a commitment from the country to work on the implementation. And so in April and May, these roadmaps were endorsed by people that attended to different training workshops that in which we participated and developed. So from now on, my slides will be structured with questions, right? So I was trying to think if someone would like to start this process, I think the first question would be how to start, right? So as I said previously, the first step would be to create a national coordination and communication body. So in this case, for Ecuador and El Salvador, the Ministry of Environment in both countries, they were the lead authority, and they help us identifying key stakeholders in the government. So they identified relevant ministries, relevant organizations, but also not only stakeholders in the government, but sectors such as civil society, labor organizations, which are very important to implement the legislation at the workplace, and of course, industry representatives. Then they had different instances of development. One of the countries, they already had a formal subcommittee, and the other country, they had I would say, a more informal committee in place. So that was the second part of, or this is the second part of the process. And important to mention here again, the role of the leading organization. If you really wanted this to happen in a short amount of time, you need an organization that is committed, that have available resources. And with resources, sometimes I mean at least one person that can have weekly hours dedicated only to collecting information and analyzing the information and participating in consultation meetings. And this is very simple and part of any project, but a work plan. It sounds very small, but how important it is to have deadlines and deliverables, very concrete deliverables, that helps a lot these kind of projects. Second question that you may think is, what is your situation, right? We need to understand what do we have in place, because many countries already have something. For that, firstly, we create what we call a national profile to understand if it's if you are a more like importer country, if you are a producer country, how are your commercial relationships, what kind of chemicals you produce or import, all of that. Then you try to understand what is there regarding your institutional level, the legal framework that you have in place, capacities, for example, laboratories, or training institutions, etc. And then then you analyze what is lacking from those different aspects. And at the end, with this strategy, what we do is to propose actions based on this situation and gap analysis that are needed, that will be prioritized and desired. And then, of course, training needs and training and the target audiences. So then for capacity assessment, as I said, the first stage was to share an Excel spreadsheet to complete. So the countries received this, and this is divided in two different sections. First one regarding organization and the institutional framework, and the second one is more related to resources available. And this spreadsheet is divided into the different hazards, and there are some fields to complete if they have regulation or not, and for assigning priority regarding the different resources available, if they are sufficient, insufficient, and additional comments that they would like to include. This is just a format, but for you to have an idea of how it looks, and it shouldn't be that hard, but sometimes it takes time, because of course getting information from all the different areas is not so easy as it sounds. Part of this situation and gap analysis is also to understand the national, regional, and international policy and framework. So it is really important to analyze if your country is part of a regional economic group. For example, we have the Asian Pacific, we have the Andean, and all of those different groups that sometimes have regional legislation or regional standards that then are implemented at the national level. So that is important, and that could guide the local work. Same for international agreements, including the ones that were previously mentioned, ILO conventions, or the International Code of Conduct for Pesticide Management, the GFC, and international funding mechanisms such as the special program and the GFC fund that will be created that could also support the implementation of GHS. So if you would like to take a look at what were the results of the projects. So in different, this is just a summary. It doesn't look like this, but this is for the means for the presentation. For regarding institutional framework, we analyzed if they had a multi-institutional working group in place or not. One of the country they had a formal group, and the other one they had a more informal, let's say. But in those two cases, the participation was not so active. So even if you already have a GHS subcommittee that was created, sometimes it doesn't have active participation, or the key governmental areas are not included. So that is one first key, I would say, lesson learned, and first step to identify who is lacking. Then coordination as well, like, is someone leading this working group? How frequently they meet, and all of that. Then we have legal framework. So we saw that one of the countries had already a national policy that was very broad and included different areas of chemicals management. And one of those areas was GHS implementation. So that is a good starting point, and you can take that as a first reference when you are drafting specific legislation for a specific sector. Then we also analyzed legislation in different sectors. In one of the countries, there were two sectors that were covered somehow, one at the local level and the other one at the regional level. We analyzed the coherence between the different legislation. We also analyzed which revision of GHS was included, and if there were specific competences among these different pieces of legislation, and if they were including monitoring and surveillance. For capacities, we noticed that they had courses for ground transportation of hazardous chemicals. However, like a integral training program for chemicals or chemicals classification and labeling was lacking. Same for information means, information sharing means, and laboratories and other economic resources to fund these kind of capacity building activities. Next question would be, okay, now we have information, now we have people committed, what's next? What kind of a strategy can we propose? So key questions would be, is there any legal instrument in place for all the key sectors and all the life cycle stages? Is it possible to use existing legal framework as a baseline? Is it possible and or feasible to promote legal regional legislation? So after you have these questions and you could analyze with existing information, then you can start developing and assessing options for the development of this legislation. Options could be integrating GHS into an overarching regulatory framework, having a standalone approach, or ensuring coordination of activities on GHS implementation with other different sectors or legislation that is more specific to one sector. In the case of the two countries that we work with, we finalized with some actions needed based on the previous gap analysis that I showed you. So for country one, there was a need to strengthen the institutional framework. Country two, the key aspect was to create a multi-sectoral working group because they didn't have this first step completed. For country one, for workplace and transport, they were more, they had something developed, but there was this need of updating. And then for consumer products, they needed to develop legislation. For country two, we only had this national policy that I mentioned previously. So drafting, building from there, they needed to develop regulation for all the sectors. And then for the two countries, there was this need of organizing awareness raising workshops and educational materials. So the strategy proposed was for one sector, working sector by sector, for one country, sorry, and for the second country to have an umbrella legislation and then sectorial legislation. Then we propose a time frame. And as I said previously, the importance of training and capacity building, organizing ongoing awareness raising sessions to engage stakeholders and also to update them. So it is really important for you to ask who will need to implement, use, or be aware of the new national GHS legal framework. So you have to include government staff, product suppliers, workers, drivers that are also important for the transport sector, emergency services staff, educators, and more. And with this final slide, I would like to say gladly that we are still working with El Salvador, in this case with funding from the Swiss government. We are having this project that started in November last year, and it will end in September this year. The idea is to have a final draft legislation. We are also doing in parallel training awareness activities and updating the roadmap based on the results of this project. So this, as you can see, is a continuity of activities and results. So thank you very much. I think, sorry, I'm over 1 minute, but feel free to ask questions, provide comments, and you have my contact there. And also want to acknowledge Oliver and Fabian for the materials for my presentation today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sophia. And yes, for us, that was a great experience. As you mentioned a few times, a very swift project. We were very efficient. And so it was great to work with you, with our senior expert in that instance, Fabian, and of course, the two countries that worked hard to undertake that project. Okay, thanks to all the presenters. We have a couple of questions that have come through. I'll try and sort of dish them out to who I think might be the most appropriate. Lennart, if I could ask you, have you had a look through some of the questions, or shall I just fire them off to you and see if you can give them a shot?
Yeah, you can fire them off. I haven't had the chance to see them.
Okay, fair enough. I'll just try and read them. Read them out. So there's one question on classification of chemicals that are procured from the internet, for example, that you bring in from Amazon. Are there any sort of shared classifications on those? I know there have been discussions, particularly within Europe, about chemicals that are brought in. But do you have any perspectives, any comments on chemicals that are brought in over the internet?
Well, my comment is that it is dangerous because you do not know really what you're getting. And I know that Elisa might be able to help me on this, that this has been a worrying matter for the inspectors at the Swedish Chemicals Agency. Lisa, would you like to help me to comment on this?
Yes, I can do that, Lennart. Yeah, the internet trade is a new, it's an area that is hard to enforce because a lot of just not companies but individuals are importing chemicals by themselves through via the internet, and then it's hard to control that they are classified and labeled correctly, or that they don't contain restricted substances, for example. So it's a problem to know if you are importing something yourself via the web.
Because the legislation in Europe, if I talk about that, because as I live in Europe, it's about the legislation covers chemicals placed on the market. So if you place something on the market, then you have a responsibility. So if you as a private individual import something, then you're, well,
for your own use.
You take a chance for your own use. That's right. It's another thing if you buy 10 bottles of something and then sell it, then you're a supplier and then you need to follow the regulation. But if you import it for your own use, I mean, you're just you're taking a chance. And it's even worse if you import some pharmaceutical drugs, for instance, then you have no idea what you're getting.
Okay. Thank you, Leonard and Lisa. There was also a question on chemicals coming from the surface of the moon or other planets. I think respectfully would leave that one unless you want to jump in with any thoughts. There was one question on specific standards. I'll just try and get exactly the wording. So, are there any specific standards for a chemical to be included in their safety data sheets? For example, sometimes a compound can be hazardous but not included in the STS, e.g. PFAS. So your thoughts on that one?
I can
There's
comment
also
on
something
that.
for Lisa, yes.
Yeah, maybe.
Lisa.
Okay. Yeah, I looked that up because I saw that question earlier, and there are criteria for that in the GHS Purple Book. Actually, it says that the STS section 3 that contains information about substances in a mixture should give the chemical identity and concentration or concentrations ranges of all ingredients which are hazardous within the meaning of the GHS and are present above their cutoff levels. So all substances that are classified as hazardous according to GHS and above a certain concentration level should be in the safety data sheets.
Yeah, but you know, Lisa, this is talk about this. If you think about the GHS as a system, and then you in the EU we have the CLP as a regulation, which is a legally binding instrument. There are hazard classes in the CLP that is not covered by the GHS, like endocrine disruptors.
Yes.
Now, that's something that, I mean, the GHS, the chemical classification system used globally is not globally harmonized in that respect. There is an element of disharmonization also. So
yes, of course.
You may have to include an endocrine disrupting substance in the European Union, because then it's classified according to the CLP, but according to GHS, it is not classified as such because there is no such as a class as yet, because this is something that is ongoing discussion. This was brought up by the European Commission, and they were quite eager to get that into legislation. So they went ahead to get it into the CLP regulation, and then they also addressed the UN subcommittee. But that discussion is ongoing. So eventually, a few years from now, we may see endocrine disrupting properties as a hazard class in the GHS, and then it should be used globally, but we are not there yet. And we are not sure either if that criteria will exactly match the CLP criteria as they are now. Could you comment on that maybe, Lisa? Because this is something that concerns me.
Yeah, of course. I tried to think about what you're saying just generally, that depending on what, I mean, you can implement different hazard categories as well from the GHS into your own legislation. And so you can have a bit different implementations of GHS in different countries. So that's just the answer that I gave was just a general one, what it says in the GHS. But of course, if it differs, that's a bigger issue. If it's a whole hazard class that's different between different regions and countries. Of course, you have to consider that.
I noted in the chat now very wise recommendation from Paul Brigandi, who's also part in the UN subcommittee of experts, that you need actually to look into the specific regulations in the country where these chemicals are handled. Thank you for that, Paul.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonard and Lisa, for your reflections. I'll give you a short break. There are some rather more technical questions coming up as well, but there was one question on a guidance or guidelines on computer software for developing labels and safety data sheets. So that is not something that Unitar's looked into. That's obviously very much linked to private sector implementation of the GHS, how they do it at the company level. It's not something that we have developed. I have heard it as an interesting topic for training, though, and it could be something we could look into in the future. There was also a question on GHS and then the FAO WHO guidelines and what's the difference? How do you transition between the two? Obviously, very easy to say that the GHS is now the classification system of choice and one should move to it. How do you do that? How does it really work? What are the differences? The good news is that we are producing some guidance, so similar materials to what you've seen today, presentations and a video specifically on GHS in agriculture that goes quite deeply into the differences and some of the sort of approaches to converting between the two. So it's not something I have available today to present to you, but keep an eye on our website and our communications, and certainly we should be able to highlight a little bit more exactly what kind of process can be done there. I'll then try and go through some of the other questions. So if you give me a moment. So there was one on why is it that legislation is often put in place in the labour sector first, certainly before others, and does this not, would it not be better to have legislation for all sectors at the same time? I know, of course, the GHS has its inbuilt flexibilities. It is not itself a legislation, but it is a system to be adopted and adapted. But Kemi has worked with many different countries. Do you have any perspectives on that in terms of single sector or across all sectors to share with the group? Lisa, perhaps to you if you'd like to, or
yes, my only because I'm pretty new in this field with international support, but I know that I've been involved in working with South Africa on several occasions with training and also with looking at their implementation of GHS in the legislation. And I know that maybe we have some participants from South Africa, I think we have, but I know that they implemented GHS in the labor legislation. And we had some discussions back then with different ministries, how we should look at the environmental criteria in the GHS and how they should implement them. But it was just, I think they thought it was like a stepwise, they were going to use a stepwise approach, start with the labor legislation to implement it there. But maybe I have some comments from, if we have some participants from South Africa, I think, if she haven't left.
Andrea
maybe
is
they
here
want to,
right now.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe
She's
they want
put
to
the
comment.
question there.
Yeah, I understand she might be also in a separate meeting, may not be able to jump on and say too much.
But another example is the US, which also have implemented GHS in the workplace sector in their hazard communication standard, without knowing the details. But I think it also has to do with the legislation and responsibilities. I mean, in the workplace, you have clear responsibilities for the employer, and you can make a legal process if something goes wrong. It's different if you look at consumer chemicals, I think. I'm not sure if Paul is still around because he is working for a consultant for OSHA. Paul, are you there? Can you put on your mic and maybe say what was the reasoning in the US when you implemented it in the workplace sector and not in all sectors?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So in the US, there is an overarching coordinating group. So especially when the GHS was developed, but it still continues. So we have Transport Consumer Product Safety Commission, which covers consumer products, EPA, which covers pesticides, and of course OSHA, as you're mentioning, which covers the workplace. And each of these different sectors is in a different sort of department of the government. They each have their own existing regulations at the time, and therefore the implementation was up to the individual ministries. And so there was an effort at one point for EPA. They had a draft paper for implementing it for pesticides, but there was pushback from the stakeholders in the US, and that's why that didn't move forward. I don't have the exact details for the Consumer Product Safety Commission, but again, it was an agency by agency decision on whether they would move forward.
Okay, thank you, Paul, because this illustrates that the situations are different in different countries. I know that Consumer Safety Commission was present in the UN's in the subcommittee of experts at one time, but they left. So that could be one reason, because the legislation and the administration, the national government administration looks different in different countries. I believe that it's slightly similar in Canada because they also have it in the workplace sector.
Thanks, Leonard, and thanks very much, Paul, for jumping in. It's been a pleasure to work with you in the past as well, so thanks very much for that. Sophia, you have your hand up, and thanks also. I see you've been addressing some of the questions in the chat, but please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. Just to follow up on this question, but I also would like to connect with an additional question that was, I think, very related. So we understand that different countries start from a different starting point, right? Some of them started from the labor sector, but transportation sector, I think it's also because of the Orange Book and starting first and all of that. So maybe they are more solid in that regard. But at the very end, I think they are. The participants are trying to ask if shouldn't there be like a common approach no matter which sector, because it seems that for some countries, depending on from which sector they come from, they get different classifications and maybe different requirements. And at least from my perspective, of course, they should be a harmonization, because you imagine we are trying to push for this system at the global level. Most importantly is to have a common approach at the national level. And so we would like to see common classifications. Then, of course, requirements and different communication methods, or well, Leonard previously explained the interactions between the Orange and the Purple Book. So, of course, then you will need to adjust regarding the sector, but we would like to see if we are talking about the same chemical, same classification. That's the real purpose behind. So if you find disparities, if you are finding different classification for the same chemical, and I want to be very clear, when we mention the same chemical, we are talking about same composition, right, and same ingredients, and following the definition of chemicals under the GHS. That's very important, because if not, of course, you will get you might get a different classification. But just to have like a final thought on this, no matter which sector, the idea is to have a common approach, right? Maybe Leonard and Lisa, you would like to complement, or Oliver, of course.
Now, if that's exactly correct, I mean, it's the same chemical, so it should have the same classification according to GHS in all sectors.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia, and Leonard as well. There are quite a few questions coming in, so we'll try and get them covered in the time we have left. One asked, where are we? About, why is it not mandatory that all countries adopting and implementing GHS have the same version in place, as well as the same hazard classes and categories? Well, I think this goes to the core of how the GHS was set up. Again, it was not set up as a convention. It is not itself legally binding text. It is a system with its inbuilt flexibilities that countries can adopt in part, building blocks, transitional periods. Can each country adjust its legislation every 2 years? in sync with all the other countries. So I think that it ultimately goes back to the reality of setting it up and what could really be done realistically. So I see you nodding, Lennart. So unless you have something to add.
I noted that Paul had a comment in the chat, but I think he took that away maybe.
It's jumping up and down.
No, it's jumped up. Yeah.
So,
if you'd like, Oliver, I can provide a perspective.
Go for it, Paul, please.
Yeah, so I was involved in the original negotiations of the GHS. At the time, I was representing industry. And the idea was that we were harmonizing existing systems. And the fact is that the existing systems that were in play, which was the US Consumer Product Safety Commission, Workplace, EPA, similar regulations from Canada, the Dangerous Substance and Dangerous Preparations directives from Europe, and the transport regulations. These were all considered the main systems. Now, all systems beyond that were also at times taken into consideration. And if you really analyze the existing systems that were in scope, they had different levels of sort of risk built into them. So, EPA, US EPA, and Consumer Product Safety Commission for some long-term chronic hazards are based on exposure and not just intrinsic properties, right? We had different sort of ideas in terms of what level of protection needed to be. So we have building blocks. For example, in the US, again, Consumer Product Safety Commission regulated materials with acute toxicity up to 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. Whereas in Europe, that was at 2,000 for the Dangerous Substance Directive, 2,000 milligrams per kilogram. And in transport, it only went up to 500 milligrams per kilogram. So you can see that the target audience, right? So for consumer products, it was children as well as elderly people. Whereas in a workplace, there was a basic assumption that you had people who weren't elderly and weren't children. And so the idea was we have a framework that is able to be implemented in different sectors that can be targeted to different target audiences. And therefore, there was no one single way to write a piece of legislation that covered all sectors that acknowledges the differences that already existed in the existing systems. And the idea was to create a global framework and not a single piece of legislation to cover all sectors. Sorry for that lengthy answer, but that's the history of how we got to where we are today.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and also that explains why the European legislation has not implemented category 5 for acute toxicity, because it was not there in the previous legislation, whereas it was in the US legislation.
Correct.
And that's one how you implement the building block approach. Thank you, Paul. You were in this business longer than me.
Thank you. Yes, I've heard some of those good history lessons on the GHS as well before. There was one question on, is there not a list of countries and what building blocks they implement, what classes and what categories? I suspect the answer is no. I know from Unitar's point of view, we have tried to build that inventory of which countries are implementing the GHS in certain sectors. That's at a general level. I think diving into legislation and truly understanding that and be able to keep that up to date is a very complex process, not one that we've been able to do. And I don't think, for example, the UNECE Secretariat is able to do that either. So I presume there's no available inventory of all that kind of data, though it is very interesting that clearly links to trade, really understanding what each sort of legislation, what each state is doing.
Oliver, I think I saw such a table in from one presentation years ago, but I don't think there's sort of an authoritative official list of what's implemented where and what classes and categories and so on. Not to my knowledge, at least.
Yeah, unfortunately so, I think. There were, linked to that question, there was is there an available tool for mixtures? So we often talk about the ECHA database, and you mentioned it. But am I correct in thinking that's substances and there are not mixtures listed? And then is there any form of tool or online system of available classifications for mixtures that you're aware of?
No, not to me. And sometimes, that companies are not willing to give away the exact composition of a mixture. That can be in intervals, and then you have to. I mean, for inspectors, I'm looking at Lisa now. They need to know the composition of the mixture in order to check that the classification is correct. But I'm sure you are aware. You have encountered this, Lisa, that they only give the percentage. It's 5 to 15% of this and that.
That is always the case when you look into safety data sheets. And yeah, but I think tools, I think companies have their own tools, but there's no, that I know of, any free tools for classifying mixtures out there.
Okay, thank you very much. Then there was another one about chemicals in products. Has the GHS covered the labeling and classification of chemicals in products, like, for example, PFOS and PFAS in the cookware pan and toxic chemicals in cosmetics? Lennart, any thoughts on that one?
Well, the GHS does not classify products or articles, but of course, if you have chemicals in the article, that chemical is of course classified, but you do not classify a frying pan or like that. Lisa, if you can help me out of this, because it's very practical. You have been involved in inspecting.
Yeah, but it's as you say. I don't know if I can add anything, but it's when you include these substances in an article, as we call it in CLP in Europe, but it's it's like a toy or a frying pan or something like that. The substances in it can be regulated, but you don't classify and label the article because the substances aren't affecting you in the same way as in a paint, for instance, or in a mixture that you handle.
But there are regulations, of course, for toys that they should not contain above a certain percentage of certain hazardous chemicals. So that's another thing. And that's something that the Swedish Chemical Agency is looking into, that the toys does not contain lead, for instance, and so on.
Yeah, if you're exposed to these substances in any way, then it should be regulated in some way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And it makes me think of under the strategic approach to international chemicals management, there was an emerging policy issue area of chemicals in products.
Yes.
Where they were looking into this in a way that work continues under the global framework on chemicals. And so there is continuing work, but yes, yeah, thank you for your reflections. We're coming close to the end here. I see Sophia's hand up. I will try and do a last scan of the questions and then we will start to close. Sophia, please.
Thank you. Just to complement the previous answer, he's also mentioning cosmetics. So that we would consider cosmetics differently. That is also part of the exclusions, but not the materials that the raw materials, the raw chemicals that will lead to a final product, that is the cosmetic. However, depending on the country, you will see some personal care products such as I don't know, deodorants or gases like are used for the body that will be labeled under GHS. So I would separate cosmetics from articles such as the cookware pen, because in those cases you will see sometimes that they are labeled under GHS.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. From what I can see, I think we've got most of the questions covered. So I will say thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you very much to Lennart, Lisa, Sophia, and Sandra for coordinating. Thanks to all those asking the questions. Paul Brigandi as well, who jumped in and provided a few extra reflections. I see one more question with a lot of percentages and quite specific. Lennart, do you see that question? Would you be interested in trying to jump in, or
Oops.
no? We have
Oh,
from
that's
Carlos.
from Carlos, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that would probably take a bit of a time. It's very specific, right?
Okay. Perhaps one
Yeah.
we would leave for another day.
Yes, I think so. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, but Carlos, feel free to get in touch, and we'll see if there's something we can provide an answer on, see if we can help. So yes, there you go. Thank you very much to the 100+ participants who joined us throughout. It was very useful for us. We want to develop this material, as we say, get it out there, let people use it. We will be using it in our trainings, but we know that there are plenty of others out there who could probably benefit from such systems. We will, or such information, we will put this on our webpage under the webinars. All the materials are developed. Some of the upcoming work will also go there as well, so please keep checking in on our website and check in with colleagues at Unitar, and I'm sure Lisa would say the same from Kemi. Please get in touch. Lisa, thanks very much overall to Kemi for the support. Are there any last words you'd like to offer as we close?
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to join this webinar and to hear, most of all, to hear all the questions. I didn't suppose we were going to get this many. So that was really interesting, and interesting comments from all. So thank you so much.
Indeed, thank you. Yes, it is very much something I've noticed from webinars. You can get a great range of questions. So we thought this time it would be very useful to have some experts, you from Kemi with your different background, and some different experiences. See if we can answer those very different questions that always come on this topic. So, okay, thank you very much. We will close there. We'll share the information we put together for the webinar, and hope to be in touch with as many of you as possible in the future. Thank you very much to all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.